Hi friends, I have a very fun topic today. I'm going to be talking about how I pick the books that I'm going to read. And I watched Shelly from Shellyish. She made a video on this topic on Monday, and I watched it and I loved her discussion on it. I had also seen before that Aaron Facer made a video about this, and the sort of question comes from a video from Steve Donahue, who asked the question, how do you pick the books you're going to read? And so, yes, I would love to talk about this today. Both Aaron and, well, all of them, all three of them brought up the topic of mood reading. Shelley specifically talked about maybe mood reading being kind of a spectrum, which is a really cool concept, I think, and it makes a lot more sense than having a very rigid idea of what a mood reader is, because I've been wondering about if I fit that description or not, and sometimes I feel like kind of not really. So the idea of the spectrum is very interesting, I think, a lot more interesting than a very kind of solid definition. So the way that I want to talk about this is, first I want to list out the ways that I come up with options for myself of books that I might want to read, to choose from. And so I'm going to be using everything that I've been reading in June as a way to kind of break it down as an example. So in May, I actually was going through Steve Donahue's best of the year list, not just last year, but all of them, and adding them to my Goodreads, because I use Goodreads as a way to catalog books that I am interested in. I don't have a large physical TBR, and so all of my ideas for books that I would like to read are all cataloged on Goodreads, and I have extensive lists for all kinds of, not just genres, but topics and themes and different things. So it's my go-to way to save books that I might be interested in. And I do have a TBR, like more specific TBR list on there, but I ignore it a lot. So, so I had a lot of the books that were on his list in mind during that time. And so then when Shelley announced her readathon for June, I already had both the Glutton and the God of Endings in the back of my mind. And so those were very easy to add to my TBR for the readathon. And it's funny that at the same time, I think Shelley was also going through those lists and looking for ideas for books that she might want to read for her readathon as well. And then also Cartucho by Nellie Campobello, I found that one through Mariana's books. That was on her TBR for the readathon. And then also The Painter's Daughters I found through Heather from Fresh Parchment as well, so another Booktube influence. I get very influenced by Booktube. So far we have Steve's Best of the Year lists, Booktube events, and Booktubers in general. Another book that I had on my pile of possibilities for the readathon was The Hours, which I found because right after reading Mrs. Dalloway, I was researching and found that book because it is inspired by Mrs. Dalloway. So that's another avenue where I'll find books, is by researching about books and finding books that are related to that one. And another option on my pile of possibilities was Jack by Marilynne Robinson, which is part of a series, and it is one of my reading goals, which I'm very flexible about, but it is one of my reading goals to read it before the end of the year. And I would actually really like to do that. I haven't done it, but that's another avenue, is my reading goals list, which is not number based. It lists authors and books that I might want to check out during the year. So the first few books that I read in the month were all from my historical fiction readathon, and so they were planned. But then right after those, I started finding very spontaneous reads through Hannah from Hannah's Books. She made a video about A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor and comparing it to Stephen King's On Slide and Road. And that's also where I got hooked on A Good Man is Hard to Find, and that was very spur of the moment. So that's another Booktube influence. But in May, I had a family member that reads a lot of classic modern American authors mention that he had tried reading William Faulkner and that it was very challenging. And I remember being very interested in it because of that. And so I actually sampled as I lay dying, and I really liked it. I didn't pick it up, but it was kind of, something that I was interested in. And so, back to the present, I read A Good Man is Hard to Find. And so now I'm very interested in exploring more Southern Gothic authors. And so I'm also now thinking, oh, maybe I'll pick that up soon. And then I also started reading Inuyasha, which I finished the first omnibus, and I picked up River East, River West, also from watching Booktube. I also picked up Between Two Fires very spontaneously because that was recommended by my husband. And I am currently rereading The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. And that one I decided to pick up because I was looking through my bookshelves trying to come up with ideas for my summer book recommendations, and I saw it and very spontaneously felt like, you know what, I am due for a reread. And yes, I featured it in my video, and then I also started reading it right away. But so I also had the topic of rereading in the back of my mind. I've been really wanting to make a video on books I'd like to reread, and I'll be working that on some point. But thinking about it, the one book that I keep thinking about is Beloved by Toni Morrison, because that's a book that I really, it really went over my head the first time I read it. And I've been wanting to read more Toni Morrison since, but I feel like it left me feeling intimidated, and I think that's kind of ridiculous. And so I would love to reread it and continue to read more Toni Morrison. And so yes, so that book is also now very much in the back of my mind, and I would really like to pick it up as well soon. So that's it for the books that I have picked up during the month, but something else that often sends me on a little rabbit hole is when there is something in a book that I'm reading, so often historical fiction, that makes me want to research more. So whether it's the time period, the location, or a figure maybe that's featured in the book, that's always really fun when I am interested enough to go find more information about one of those things, and it leads me to finding books related to those things. And then the last thing is any kind of literary reference in a book, so whether it's another book or an author. I love when there's references like that in books, and taking note of those to look into. Okay, so these are all the different sort of avenues where I get ideas for books, and I can compile a sort of list to choose from. And so on one side, I will have some that are very planned. So for like the readathon, I had my pile of possibilities. But then from that pile, the way that I choose to prioritize is very much on what is most exciting to me in the moment. And so some of those are not going to get addressed, and some of them will very quickly. And then some I end up picking up very spontaneously because of excitement in the moment, but they're not so planned. So that is how I pick books. It is a combination of planning and spontaneity, you know, and what gets prioritized is definitely based on mood and excitement. So the biggest thing is if you can surround yourself with all kinds of avenues for finding recommendations that might make you really excited, that's the most useful thing, I think. But so now on the topic of mood reading, I'd like to address DNFing, which means did not finish, so giving up on books. I think giving up on books is super important. Life is way too short to be wasting time on books that you are not loving, so if you can come up with some kind of criteria to detect when a book is not worth finishing, I think it's really, really helpful. And I don't think it has to be like a super clear idea. I think that following your gut is sometimes more than enough. I personally have not had very many times when I do stick with a book that I am wanting to give up on and I end up loving. It's just not something that happens very often. I end up feeling much happier that I gave up on something and moved on to something that worked better for me. But if you're like me and you can get kind of anxious about feeling like, what if I'm wrong and I'm missing out, then the practice of keeping notes while you're reading, even if they're messy, just a word or two, not even full sentences, can be really helpful. But whether you do keep notes or not, once you get to a point where you're starting to doubt if you want to continue or not, I think that trying to pinpoint where in the book you started to lose interest or your feelings started to shift, if you can kind of pinpoint what it is that did it. So maybe the introduction of a certain character or the tone changed or, you know, things like that. If you can have somewhat of an understanding of what it is that's causing you to feel differently, then it almost becomes like evidence. And so that way you can have somewhat of a sense of why. It doesn't have to be entirely clear, in my opinion. I think that as long as you have something like evidence that you can point to not feel guilt about choosing to give up, then you can feel more conviction in that choice. So I find it very helpful. So yes, I'm a big fan of DNFing. In terms of mood reading though, I don't feel like when I give up on books, it really feels like my mood shifted and that's why I'm giving up on a book. I very much have a pretty clear idea of what it is that I am not enjoying, and that really means that the book is not for me, and so I'm not going to regret giving up on it. The only times that I've been more fickle is when it comes to very long books, usually classics, and whether I'm reading or rereading, and I kind of get cold feet about committing to the length. But that's a little bit different because I'm not truly DNFing. I will pick it back up at some point when I'm feeling more confident about committing to that long book. So to conclude, I think that in terms of mood reading, in that spectrum, I guess I fall somewhere in the middle maybe, because I really like having a planned list that I can look at and choose from, but then also leaving room for spontaneous books to come into my periphery and get me all excited. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion. I hope you enjoy this topic. Let me know, are you a mood reader? Are you super planned and organized, or are you super fickle and mood-based, or are you like me and kind of somewhere in the middle? Let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.